You're listening to Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us. Cow-calf producers with a spring calving herd. We're right in the midst of that most demanding of seasons, and that is the spring calving season for many of you. And our guest now is on the receiving end of quite a few calls and reports about, well, calving issues. Gregg Hanzlicek, Mike's side once more. He's the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit with the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. Gregg, this is not anything that's necessarily new, but maybe the frequency of issues this year is up a bit. What's the sense of it as you look at it?
And I agree. When we talked about maybe covering that today, I just put together what we've been seeing this year, and it seemed like the regular stuff, but we're pretty early in the calving season, so it does seem like we've seen a lot more of these issues we're going to talk about today than we have in the previous years.
Well, let's tick through several of the examples that are all too prevalent, unfortunately, in the cow-calf herd this spring. And weakness in calves to the extent of a stillborn calf. We're hearing plenty of that, you say.
We are, and of the cases that we've looked at, vast majority are non-infectious, meaning the tissues that are sent in for these calves are normal, and then we do not isolate any infectious disease. So at this point in time, we think most of these are non-infectious causes of either stillborn or weak calves.
In other words, it's a dystocia issue?
It could be a dystocia issue, and that's one of the things we need to talk about is that sometimes when we say we have a stillborn calf, maybe it wasn't stillborn, but it went through a dystocia, and dystocia is hard on calves. We know that dystocia is difficult enough on calves that it can make them weak after calving. So when producers say that they have a stillborn or weak calf, maybe one of the things they just ask is, or somebody that's out there actually helping them calve is, did this heifer or this cow actually go through a dystocia? And maybe that explains why this calf ended up the way that it did.
Now, on that specific point, you say there's a way to fairly handily distinguish between the stillborn calf and simply the weak calf that did not survive.
Yes, that's right. So one of the easy ways to do it is just to take a piece of lung from the calf that doesn't survive and put it in water. If it floats, then it's a pretty good indication that calf at least took a breath of air, and that would not be a stillborn. That'd be just a calf that didn't survive during the calving process or shortly after that.
And that might be worth knowing as you think ahead to the next breeding season then, and if that particular female is dystocia prone or not.
Exactly, and that goes back to picking the proper bulls to make sure that we don't have oversized calves and all those kind of things. You bet.
What about nutrition? And this has been brought up considering our dry weather in recent months and whether that had anything to do with the nutritional plane of the females.
Yeah, so a lot of us, at least in the College of Veterinary Medicine, believe that nutrition probably has the biggest impact on stillborn and weak calves. And for a lot of us, number one, it's protein, energy, deficiencies. A lot of people just say protein, but a lot of times they're both. As we get into late gestation, the calf, the placenta, the uterus are all gobbling up everything that they can to grow. And if the cow's on a plane of nutrition that doesn't meet that, then that calf is going to suffer the consequences of it when it gets close to calving.
So thinking about that, we talk about body condition as a way to gauge the nutrition level of that cow going into that last trimester and such. Is that something that needs to be watched more closely here? What?
Well, a lot of us believe that it should be. Body condition scoring actually should start towards the end of the pasture season when the grasses turn brown to make sure that we maintain body condition. But starting 90 to 100 days before calving, that's a really good time to have either the producer or somebody with fresh eyes come in and body condition the score, because body condition is kind of a proxy for nutritional levels. So we believe it's an important tool.
But you'd like to see producers go one further and actually manage that ration more acutely, if you will.
Absolutely. The last time that a national survey was completed with cow-calf producers, less than 25% of the producers said that they had their forages sampled, analyzed in the laboratory, and then a proper ration made for those animals. And it's such an inexpensive tool to use, and it really helps those cows and those calves as they go into the calving season. So we highly recommend testing forages and having an appropriate ration built for those cows as they get close to calving.
Gregg, you say also that you're hearing from producers whose calves may have experienced hypothermia to the point of losing calves. And, well, it is winter and this does happen, but it can often be prevented, of course.
It can, and usually it's one or two calves, but we've had a couple cases, certainly this year and over the past couple of years, where it was multiple calves in several herds. And what it apparently was is that these calves were born normally and there weren't any issues, but they were born in a very cold spell. They became hypothermic very, very quickly. And once they become hypothermic, they lose their suckle reflex, so they're not trying to nurse the cow. And because they don't have hardly any brown fat is what we call it, which is fat that they can use for energy and for making heat, those calves become hypothermic. They become very lethargic. People will even call them dummy calves. Mm-hmm. And it's basically just the fact that these calves get cold and then they're not taking the nourishment that they need to be taken in to get over the coldness.
And that's where the producer needs to intervene. And to be sure, if hypothermia is the issue at hand, one can easily test for that, you say?
Yes, there's several signs that a calf is hypothermic, but the best one is just use a rectal thermometer. And if that thermometer is 100 degrees or lower, we need to warm that calf up just as soon as we possibly can. We recommend a hot box or a pickup floor, and then we need to also think about not only warming up the outside of that calf, but getting some warm colostrum replacer inside that calf, either with a bottle or a stomach tube.
And we've talked about that ad nauseum. Colostrum intake at the early stages of calving is an absolute. Otherwise, you'll likely lose that calf.
Absolutely. We need that. We need to make sure we're getting colostrum in that calf, whether it's from the mother or a commercial product in that calf within that first 2 to 6 hours after calving, or we're going to set them up for failure basically down the road.
And you say then there's vitamin deficiency potential. Vitamin A, which we talked of not too long ago as something that producers needed to key on in their late gestation management, well, deficiencies may be showing up there nonetheless.
Absolutely. And this is kind of a yearly thing that we go through in the diagnostic lab, is that especially drought years, we'll see vitamin A deficiency that's causing either weak or stillborn calves. And this year is not an exception. The last time we talked about vitamin A here, we were talking about how it's in short supply. Mm-hmm. And so the price has gone up. So we were highly recommending that producers not reduce that amount that's going in those cows because of the price.
Hopefully they didn't do that. But in any event, there are episodes of this deficiency out there. And you say those who may have even used older mineral that they'd had on hand may actually not be getting the job done in providing enough vitamin A.
Absolutely. So vitamin A is in any green forage. So hays that we've stored for a long period of time, that vitamin A content is decreasing through time. Some pretty good research has shown that vitamin A in a mineral, after about 6 months, you lose up to 50% of that vitamin A content. So if we're using old hays or drought hays or old mineral, the tag may be okay, may look like there's plenty of vitamin A, and there was at the time, but now we're at a vitamin A level that's not sufficient for that cow and her calf.
So if a producer has losses, calf losses they can't explain, they might revert back to this possibility.
Absolutely, I absolutely would, and there's a good blood test that we can actually take blood from the dam and assess her vitamin A status.
It's not just vitamin A, though, you say. There are a couple of other minerals that could be in short supply, so to speak.
There's other areas in the United States, the upper Midwest, where they've looked at a lot of stillborns and weak calves, and what they've found is that they're deficient in either and or both vitamin E and selenium. The mechanism of why that's true, nobody really knows. That's something that we don't normally see here. But again, that's a possibility, and that goes back to proper ration balanced and then a proper mineral selected for those cows, and then making sure that they're eating the proper amount of the mineral.
Yeah, consult your veterinarian in that potential case then.
Absolutely.
As usual. Here's one more that maybe producers didn't recognize, and that is nitrate toxicity at low levels that may not have affected the dam, but certainly the calf.
Absolutely. It's not real common, but we've diagnosed several cases where we couldn't find out what was going on with these calves that were born primarily weak, and then stumbled on the fact that they were on either a sorghum silage or a sorghum sudan or even a dryland corn silage that had enough nitrate in there that wasn't toxic for the dam, but was at a high enough level that it was causing issues in these newborn calves. And we diagnosed that through looking at the nitrate levels in the calves that did not survive the process.
So the message there is, again, if you had any doubts about that harvested forage, you should have had it tested for nitrate.
Absolutely. So especially dryland corn silage, oat hay. We don't talk about oat hay and oat straw. That's a nitrate accumulator. Anything that's sorghum sudan or sorghum, I would have it tested for nitrates before I feed it.
We appreciate the report from the laboratory on what's being seen and heard about from out there, and we'll talk again soon, Gregg.
Thank you.
He's Gregg Hanzlicek, College of Veterinary Medicine's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And running through there some of the common issues we're seeing in this spring beef calving season around Kansas so far. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll return shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now. Well, at the present, the discussions on Capitol Hill over the makeup of the 2018 Farm Bill are fairly subdued, more behind the scenes than not at this point. But soon the open debate will begin. As we've been telling you about right here, K-State and the University of Nebraska are teaming up to host 5 Farm Bill forums this week and next in Kansas and Nebraska, the first of which will be held tomorrow in southwest Kansas. Recently, the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker talked with 2 of the presenters at these forums, K-State agricultural economists Art Barnaby and Mykel Taylor, about key Farm Bill talking points. As Mykel observes, this Farm Bill will be crafted in a farm economy environment far different from that of the 2014 bill.
Just in the past 5 years since the 2014 Farm Bill was passed, we've had a dramatic change in the farm economy. The profitability has declined significantly for farmers in most commodities. And so the objectives of making sure that it serves as a safety net to making sure that these farms can continue producing, that objective doesn't change, but how we go about accomplishing it might have to change because of the change in the profitability in the sector.
And they were given 2 choices between a revenue plan and a price plan in the last Farm Bill. So a lot of speculation on what people will do this time around. What we're hearing is they're likely to have to make the same choice with a few minor changes to those 2 programs, but likely have to make the same choice. They do have to meet conservation requirements to receive those payments. Now, most farmers in Kansas are in compliance with the conservation requirements. You get into some other states, that's not necessarily true.
Conservation requirements. Now, is that set by the Farm Bill?
Well, yes, it is. And there are proposals in this one to increase certain conservation requirements or conservation programs. What we're hearing is that there isn't a lot of appetite for spending money on those conservation programs. The one that most people have heard of is the conservation reserve payments, which basically you get paid to take land out of production and plant it to grass. You can also plant it to trees. Most of the people in Kansas are planting it to grass. One congressman in particular wants to expand those acreage, put more acres in CRP. But it comes back to where you're going to get the money from to do that with. Because, see, they get a payment for – think of it as just renting it to the government. You rent some farmland to the government, and the government says, I want my land planted to grass. You do that, and they pay you for that.
Do you make enough money off the conservation program to make up for a crop that you might have planted instead?
It depends on how valuable that alternative crop was. 4 or 5 years ago, people didn't want to be in CRP because we had $7 corn. They would much rather have been producing crops. Today, with commodity prices where they are being low, CRP is a good is a good place to be. But they cap the total number of acres that we can have in CRP nationwide. So it's not a free-for-all. You can't just put any farm into CRP. It has to be environmentally sensitive or ecologically sensitive type ground. It has to qualify under a certain set of criteria in order to get enrolled in CRP.
Now, under a new farm bill, do they change requirements like for conservation?
They can. They're looking at changing the number of acres because a few years back they really cut the number of acres in CRP and in order to increase the rental rates. So they were sort of chasing their tail. With high commodity prices, people didn't want to re-enroll in CRP. So the federal government wanted to raise the CRP rents in order to attract people to stay in CRP or to get into CRP. Now that required cutting the number of acres because they were expending more on the acres that they had. Now that we're in the opposite situation, things change very quickly in the farm economy, and now we're in the opposite situation, and that's where Congress would like to raise the number of acres by dropping the rents a little bit on those CRP acres.
An example in the last farm bill was on the crop insurance title. They required farmers for the first time to be in conservation compliance. Wasn't a real big issue here in Kansas because I said most farmers were already in compliance, but it did become a problem in other states like California. They're growing non-program crops that are not eligible for Title I. These are fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing. All those crops are insurable, but they'd never had to be in compliance before. So now you had all these people who have never dealt with FSA all of a sudden has to go to FSA to fill out the paperwork and do whatever was necessary to get into compliance. The other place that was a big issue was in North Dakota. You have these little wet spots in the field, and in the dry years you farm through them, and the wet years, well, they're duck ponds. They've been doing that for quite some time, and all of a sudden now they couldn't buy insurance on that land because that took them out of conservation compliance. The prairie potholes, as they referred to it, that was a big issue in the last farm bill. There are people that want to take out the conservation requirement for crop insurance, but I personally don't think that's going to happen. If anything, they may strengthen it.
Another radical idea is means testing, and basically looking at the incomes of farmers and deciding who does and doesn't get to receive payments or who has caps on the amount of payments that they receive.
So what kind of an impact does the Farm Bill have on the local grocery store and what I buy?
Well, if you're living in a rural community, it has a rather direct impact because the viability of the farm sector, the ability to navigate through some of these low income periods like the ones that we're doing right now, the Farm Bill provides a farm safety net so that those farms can keep going and they have access to credit and they can keep producing, and that allows them to economically stay vibrant in their community. And so I think that when we think about rural communities, they're very heavily dependent on farmers' economic success, and so it feeds in very directly. The other people that are affected very directly by the Farm Bill are those receiving SNAP benefits, or what we used to call food stamps. And for them, this is where they get that funding for that program.
I would add that the crop insurance really is backing a lot of credit and allows farmers to take that guarantee and leverage it into financing, and that keeps your rural banks in place because if the crop fails, the farmers will get payments. They may take the check and hand it over to the lender, the principal payments and the interest payments, or at least the interest payments. But nonetheless, without that, I think credit would be more difficult to get, and particularly when you're dealing with low prices, it is a tough time to get financing, and that's the one thing we're hearing all the time. If anything, there are more farmers that want to buy more crop insurance coverage than what they're allowed to, simply because in some cases the prices are so low that the guarantee and their expected revenue from the crop itself may not be sufficient to really make any financial progress. I don't know that we've got a lot of people that are close to bankruptcy. You've been tracking some of that, how difficult it is, but yeah.
Going back to your question, though, about what does it do for what I buy for food for my family, I think there is a conception that the Farm Bill is just for big farmers, that it only supports those big Iowa corn farmers, and that's not true. There's several programs contained within the Farm Bill that support small farms, beginning farmers, specialty crop farmers, people that are trying to participate in farmers markets. So the Farm Bill they try to accomplish something that works for all types of farms in all parts of the country. And so it will have an impact on what kinds of, produce and fruits and vegetables and things that you can purchase, not just on the Iowa corn producers.
You may want to correct me on this, but it's always been my assumption that the reason I get a pretty decent price at the grocery store is because of subsidies found in the Farm Bill.
That's an element of it. I think the reason that you have such a good price at the grocery store is because the productivity of U.S. farmers, and it's grown over time. But to the extent that the Farm Bill provides research dollars to state universities, and that goes into new seed, new irrigation technologies, so on and so forth, those things add to productivity, and that in turn allows us to produce more food, and therefore it's cheaper.
K-State's Mykel Taylor and Art Barnaby talking with the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker. It's not too late to take part in one of these 5 Farm Bill forums, the program identical at each, so choose the one nearest you. Tomorrow in Dodge City at the Knights of Columbus, Thursday, March the 1st, here in Manhattan at the Riley County Fairgrounds. Then next week, Monday, March the 5th, at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center at Meade. Tuesday, March 6th, at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff, and Wednesday, March the 7th, at the Adams County Fairgrounds in Hastings. All start with registration at 8:30 in the morning, $30 at the door, but you can still pre-register for the Nebraska meetings and get a break on the registration fee there. It includes lunch and all the proceedings. Find out more at agmanager.info. Again, it's all covered at agmanager.info. If you can at all, please do take one of these meetings in. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Welcome back, and joining us once more for another visit on wildlife management is Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Here's a topic, Charlie, we've not taken up before, and it's about the woodpecker, common to Kansas, of course, and how it adapts to what you might term the rigors of pecking, which can be a rather vigorous exercise.
Yes, woodpeckers experience forces up to 1,200 G's while pecking. So it's assumed that due to their evolutionary adaptations that the woodpecker is immune to brain injury. But a recent study that was published by researchers at the Boston University School of Medicine tried to make a determination if the woodpecker brains were experiencing abnormal proteins called taus that were similar to those that were found in chronic traumatic encephalopathy that has been identified in 111 NFL football players that had been studied, and found this protein, the protein tau, in 110 of the 111 that had been examined. So they had the idea to see if woodpeckers also experienced that buildup of that protein. So they took woodpecker brains and compared them to red-winged blackbird brains, which are not a pecking species, and come back with the idea that the protein was found in woodpecker brains, so they said that there is a possibility that woodpeckers are experiencing some sort of brain damage because of that unusual force on the brain and the skull.
So that protein was highly prevalent in woodpeckers then?
Well, they have some caveats. A very small study sample, but yes, that protein was found in 3 of the 10 woodpecker brains that were examined. So, they're concluding that further work is needed to see if that's really a pathological instance or if that's something that's just been developed through evolution and shows that there is some sort of adaptation to allow them to continue to accept and withstand that constant increased G-force. But I think what it did for me was just made me realize that, yes, woodpeckers have some very unique adaptations that allow them to do some wonderful things, including at times peck holes in the sides of people's homes. And that's the part where I get the calls when woodpeckers are into the side of a home, and people are very concerned about that. But we have to really think and understand what sort of adaptations that they have to enable them to do that.
And what would those be?
Well, first is the bill. The woodpeckers are often described and characterized as chisel-billed. They peck into living or dead wood. Sometimes they will peck on guttering or even cement siding. But they peck for a couple of different reasons. Part of that is called drumming, where they're just making noise, so that's a form of communication. But they also peck to build nesting or roosting holes and also to find food. So there's been some special adaptations to allow them to peck a hole which can be very small, up to the size of maybe a loaf of bread into the side of a tree or cavity.
But it's beyond just the bill, is it not, in terms of how they consume their food sources?
Well, the woodpecker tongue is also very specialized. They're long, they're barbed at the tip, they're sticky. The tongue actually anchors up around their skulls, almost to the crown of their head. Some woodpeckers have a tongue that's as long as 5 inches so that they can snare down into those holes that they've pecked out and bring out insects. They peck maybe at times of 12,000 pecks a day, so their skull has to be adapted to survive that amount of shock. They also have some very unique structures for their feet. Their feet are specially adapted to cling and grasp onto trees. There's 2 toes that face forward and 2 that face backwards. And most songbirds have 3 toes that face forward and only 1 backward. So you can see they've had some special adaptations. Another one that you don't think of, but if you look closely when they're on the side of a tree or on the side of your feeder, they use their tail, which is a very stiff tail feathers, as a prop while they're climbing in order to balance themselves. They also have unique feathers that are very bristly, that are kind of designed to screen their nostrils so that they don't inhale wood particles when they chisel those pieces out. And then finally, an adaptation is around their eyes. If that many chips are flying out, they have a nictitating membrane, which is drawn across the eye for protection, that allows them to see through, but it also cleanses as it moves across the eye. So I think it's interesting to see the adaptations that woodpeckers have, and this is the time of year when we're going to continue to see woodpeckers in the woods. Perhaps they're still utilizing your feeder, and hopefully as breeding season approaches, they won't be using the side of your home.
And if they are, just as a note in closing, there are means of contending with that potential damage and perhaps preventing it from occurring.
Yes, I'd like for people to kind of focus on the good things that woodpeckers do in creating habitat not only for themselves but for other animals. Realize that not all of them peck holes in the sides of homes.
Once again, a study was recently conducted to see if cerebral damage is incurred by woodpeckers because of the rapid-fire pecking away at wood and the impact that occurs there. And it's an interesting facet of their adaptation to their pecking nature. Charlie, thanks for this background on the common woodpecker today. He's Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And so goes our Tuesday edition. Once more, we'd invite you to look into and subscribe to our podcast, which will be automatically downloaded to your mobile device or laptop or desktop each day. To access that service, please go to our website, ksre.ksu.edu/news. Click on the Radio Network tab to the left side of that page, and then the Agriculture Today link for the instructions on subscribing. Again, at ksre.ksu.edu/news. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in today. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.